Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Total Human Optimization Podcast. Today, I got a whole lot of people that know what they're talking about. We got Mr. John Wolfe over here from the Onnit Academy, Cameron Joss, also at Onnit Academy with DeFranco's Gym, and our special guest today, Andreo Spina, Dr. Andreo Spina, the master of all mobility. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's a pleasure.
So let's start off. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you know our guy John Wolfe over here. Tell us a little bit what you're about.
Let's see. I, by trade, I'm a sport chiropractor and acupuncturist. Studied kinesiology before that, but after I graduated, I developed some systems of assessment and treatment and rehab that I've been teaching now for several years. And actually, John, I was lucky enough to have him at one of the seminars not too long ago, so that's how we met, and that brings us right here. I like to keep that part short, eh? That question's asked a lot, and it's, that's pretty much me.
Yeah. I mean, it was great to catch up with Dre the first time. I didn't let him know until after the seminar, like, hey, I work for Onnit, and it was great because sometimes it's a lot more fun just to be the quiet student off to the side and just absorbing all the awesome information that's shared. I went to the seminar in outside of Portland at a mutual friend's gym, Dewey Nielsen, and he's just a great mover. So I found Dewey's Instagram really inspiring. I like ground-based movement, all this mobility stuff is a huge part of what we do at the Academy, but I found myself challenged to be able to even come close to approximating some of the movement skills that Dewey was performing, and then Dre was. And then what I realized in it was that I was missing the process, right? So, people, that's what people do is they go online and they see people move, and then they approximate what is going on because they don't really understand what's going on. And I knew after looking that I just wasn't able to pull those key pieces of knowledge out of what is their process. So it was different enough so that I had to show up. I think I registered 10 months before the seminar, and I think that was common practice because it was sold out. It was a packed house full of lots of movers and shakers in the industry, and it was so good that every seminar I've taught through the Onnit Academy, if people have gone through the seminar, we're really big about promoting other teachers that complement what we're doing or provide insights that take what we're teaching and take it another level or take any of the concepts deeper. And I'm always trying to say, hey, you guys have to check out the FRC system and Dr. Spina or Dr. Dre.
Dr. Dre.
Yeah.
Dr. Dre.
Yeah, it's funny because when you met me, you were like, you came up and you're like, oh yeah, I love the seminar, and I work for Onnit. I was like, I love Onnit. I love that stuff. I get that stuff all the time.
Yeah, it was cool. It was good lead in. Go on it.
Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, like what you were saying is the approach. It's really about fundamentals, and it's about building the prerequisites for movement, and that's exactly what the initial drive was to create the system. So like we were saying before, I come at it from a different standpoint because I get to see the results of people who try complicated movements in training because I get them in my office after they get injured. So from a fundamental level, when I was creating my systems, I looked at it, there's kind of a continuum of taking a human and keeping that human functioning well. And the continuum is, there's assessments for things that are wrong or for dysfunctions. Then we have treatment, and then we have rehabilitation, and then we have training. So what my systems are pretty much covering the gamut of assessment, treatment, rehabilitation, and training. And they're very much overlap, but I have a system called functional range release that I certify people in, which is really looking at soft tissue assessment, teaching people how to find problems in soft tissue before problems arise in the gym or on the field or in the cage or wherever. So we have the assessment system and the treatment system. That's functional range release. We also introduce rehab. And then moving forward from that, we have this functional range conditioning, which kind of carries on from the rehabilitation process into the actual training of functional mobility, building tissue resilience, and keeping your joints healthy. And I thought that there was a gap in the marketplace where people were just bypassing many steps They'd get injured on this side. They'd come in here to get assessed, treated, and rehabbed, and then people were thrown back into the fire of training. But there's a step in between after your rehab and putting yourself back into training. If you're just going back into training with the same structure, function that you had before you got injured, then you really shouldn't be surprised when the injury reoccurs, right? So there was for FRC specifically, for functional range conditioning, I wanted to bridge the gap between training and rehab and getting people's body ready for the stressors of training.
Okay, so where do these problems usually come from? If you have a person that hasn't trained before and they come in and they already have a problem that you found in an assessment, and I'm talking in just normal human culture, maybe the office guy that sits in a desk all day, a construction worker, doesn't matter. What are causing these problems?
I believe, and I mean, the belief is obviously supported by quite a bit of lines of literature, but I think there's a fundamental problem in how humans carry themselves as humans, right? So you can take someone and put them in a gym, they're relatively good functioning, they see someone doing an exercise, like you saw Dewey doing something on Instagram, and almost immediately the first comment's always going to be, oh, that's cool, let's try that. And honestly, I want the second comment to be me saying, don't do that. Like, just because someone else can do a movement, it doesn't mean you can. So getting back to it, you take humans in modern culture and you look at what are they doing? How do they carry themselves? What does civilization force them to do? And what it forces them to do is non-human things. Like for our bodies still think we're in the forest hunting and gathering food. Our body evolved in a way that we require constant motion, climbing, running, fighting, jumping, whatever. That's what all of the systems are designed to do, and that's what a human has evolved to become. But we haven't really changed our needs in the last, let's say, 80,000 years. But now you put in civilization, you put in sitting at a desk, you put in wearing shoes, which completely dampen any sensory information coming from the floor. You put in podcasts, you put in fake activities like sports, right? Like, for example, hockey. I'm Canadian, so I bring up hockey. It's not a normal thing to ask a human to push sideways on a blade to propel yourself forward. Mm-hmm. What's normal is running, which is pushing a sagittal plane to propel yourself forward. So you throw people into these artificial movements and these games that we play, and then you say to yourself, why are there so many groin injuries in hockey? Well, it's because you're playing hockey. So when I deal with my MLB teams, a big question is, how do we stop the pitchers from getting UCL injuries in their elbow? Don't be a pitcher. I mean, these things aren't normal human activities. We weren't made or evolved to do these types of things. So getting back to your question, what's causing the problems in the gym? The thing that's causing the problems in the gym is that I think we're starting off of a non-functional human base. If we started off from a functional human base, let's say we took kids and we encouraged play and movement and jumping and what kids like to do. By the time they're our age, training, my job is obsolete. If they did everything properly, they have all of the fundamental movements, their joints are healthy enough to do what you're asking them to do. What we're doing is we're throwing people into these complicated movements, but before we do that, nobody's asking, does your shoulder do the things necessary to make that movement successful?
And this is something that in the seminar you touched on really well, and you quantify certain things, right? So you're like saying, hey, well, people say we were talking about various different activities, so sports, and now you have the advent of a new sport, and the new sport's CrossFit. So it's awesome what CrossFit has done in terms of bringing awareness to the general marketplace regarding traditional strength training methodologies, but they've taken those things out of the traditional context and they put them into a uniquely programmed event. So there's really big challenges with certain things there, and then you have a prescription for an exercise within a program or within an event. And maybe one of those things, and something you had talked about in the seminar, was something like an overhead squat. So you have all these competitors, right? And a big segment of the people, those competitors who are very fit and highly functioning human beings in most contexts, and then you stress their structure to hold a significant weight overhead and then go through a full range squat. And what Dre simplifies to say is like, well, what if your ankle can't, when he's explaining what he's saying, he's basically just saying like, what if your ankle doesn't have the degree of freedom to get your knee to travel far enough forward so that you can have your spine stacked over your hips and be able to support that load with the natural distribution of that weight, so that you're not stressing one part of your body to the degree that you're going to likely cause an injury. Well, there's most of the time, most of the people that are going into it, there's not that step, right? There's not that step to even think about like, well, do I have proper amount of ankle flexibility? And he blew my mind. He's like, well, if I was going to let somebody overhead squat, I want their knee to be able to travel somewhere around 6 inches past their toe. And I'm sitting there on the side and like trying to test it. I'm like, well, that's 3.5, maybe.
But
4.
it's a very basic concept, right? If you want to do a movement, there's prerequisites in order to accomplish the movement. If you don't have the prerequisites, you might accomplish the movement, but something else will have to take the stress.
Yeah.
So going into an overhead squat, if you give me a room full of 100 people and you say the exercise for the day is, overhead squats and whatever, the fact that you're clearing 100 people randomly to do overhead squats says a lot about how well you understand prerequisites. Because for me, you give me a random sample of 100 people, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 have what is necessary to do that safely. And I think the industry now is, this is how you overhead squat. Okay, try it. You're not doing it properly. And a lot of the times, the solution for that is to kind of yell louder. If the coach is saying, get to proper depth and they're not getting there, they just start raising their voice and getting more intense, telling them to get there. Now, your body can compensate like crazy. You can get there, but I don't think you want to. And another example is the handstand we were talking about.
Yeah.
Handstands and hand balancing is so popular now. I don't know why people want to do hand balancing. It's great, fine. But if I go to it's usually a patient because they've injured themselves doing handstands, and I show me what your wrist does in extension, and they go like this. I say, well, if your wrist only goes that far, why do you think it's a good idea to propel your entire body weight onto these small little joints? I mean, if you can't do a movement unloaded, you shouldn't be surprised when you injure yourself loading that movement. And that's,
Cameron, so you deal with a lot of people, a lot of athletes and general public as well, that are really into the heavy weightlifting.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're seeing in regards to what he's talking about, and how do you deal with those people that come in, want to lift those heavy weights, but they're doing it all wrong,
right?
And you got to take them back to step one.
Well, it's interesting, hearing Dre and John talk about all this stuff because, he brought up the example of CrossFit. Obviously, CrossFit is something that covers a huge, wide range of all different types of disciplines with regards to movement as a discipline within itself, right? So, movement is sort of your universal language of anything that's performed physically. So sports are certainly all about movement. So you look at something like CrossFit, it's very skill oriented, but that's something that goes in line with every sport you have. So you have to understand that skill itself is something that has to be trained. It's just like we were talking about before, mobility is something that has to be trained constantly. So like people think of something as skill, like they say skill is something you have or you don't, right? That's a bunch of BS. It's something you can totally acquire. Some people get it a little faster than others, doesn't mean it's unattainable. So the other thing with regards to skill work is that you have what we refer to in the sports physical preparation realm as your general skill work and your specific skill work. So your specific skill work is what am I doing on the field of play? If I'm a football player, what am I doing as a lineman, as a defensive back, as a receiver in the game? Am I running routes? Am I blocking guys? Whatever. That's my specific movement in that game. Your general skill work is really kind of tying in with, I guess, the FRC system and just mobility in general is just how much general, and on it as well, is how much general movement capacity do we have to attain a global perspective of different mobility and movement categories and things like that. So we're talking about, an overhead squat. Like, do I have the movement capacity to even do that skill? So it's like the same thing in football. Do I have the movement capacity to, run a good route or anything like that? Or am I limited in my hips, my ankles, my shoulders, whatever it might be that's going to inhibit my ability to perform that skill properly? So what we do on the DeFranco side is when we have guys come in, we look at what we train as just as a quality that we need to be addressing and that needs to be built. So we're not bringing somebody in and saying like we're married to any one exercise. So we're not, we do a lot of clean and jerks, we do a lot of snatches, we do a lot of heavy squats. That people have their philosophies like that. That's not what we do. So you'll hear Joe DeFranco, he'll refer to us as sort of the mixed martial arts of training, if you will. So what we do is we find the simplest path to get to the quality that we're trying to develop. So if somebody comes in and they're physically incapable of hitting a full range deep squat with perfect spine position, hips, knees, ankles, everything in good position, we just don't do it. Or so what we do is we'll address something that we can train. Maybe they can do a single leg Bulgarian split squat and they can work on their mobility using that motion right there, but they can't quite attain the bilateral squat pattern. So while we're working on this loaded Bulgarian split squat, that's our overloaded movement that we can build strength with. But at the same time, we're trying to mobilize that bilateral position in our warm-ups before the workout, maybe after the workout, during the workout with some more you take regression exercises and try to work yourself into that type of an exercise. So that's what we do. We look at things as them being trainable. Same thing with like power output, right? We figure out the easiest way to develop power output. If it's an Olympic lift, great. If it's not an Olympic lift, there's a ton of other things you can do. So regards to movement, it's all about understanding where somebody's at and then how you can maybe get them gradually more complex and open up their skill set, so to speak.
I would say that's exactly how I would recommend trainers run through the process. What I add to that is that when let's say you can't do this exercise or that exercise and you're regressing the exercises, I'm almost regressing the regression. And I'm saying, okay, let's pull it right back. Let's say the regression's not working, which is possible.
Yeah.
Does your hip work like a hip is designed to work? It's really, really fundamental. When people ask me what I do, I say I do very basic things. Let's make a hip for you. If your hip doesn't act like a hip, then whatever you do involving your hip, it's not going to go well. So let's make you a hip, and let's give your hip the degrees of freedom to be able to withstand the variables that you find during training. But I think fundamentally where the problem is, it's not a problem, where what I like to discuss a lot about is what is movement? Because that is fundamentally the question that I think the confusion stems from. Because in the industry, there is an illusion that movements are somehow programs that are stored in your brain, and that you have a little dude or a little girl that lives in your brain that's kind of pulling on levers and pressing buttons. So if I want to squat, I go over here, grab the squat, load up squat, press enter, and then we squat. But it seems from literature that that's not how movements are created. It doesn't things like movements are stored. And the reason we know that is because if you take an athlete like, let's say Tiger Woods or a great golfer, you would expect that every time they swing the golf club, the exact same pattern and path is taken. But what the literature shows is the exact opposite. Every time they swing, the body uses a completely different path. So it seems like movement is an intention to change body position, a solution formulated on the spot by the nervous system, and then a discharge of that particular sequence of pattern. And then as variables come in, your body has to deal with the variables as you go. Now, the funny thing is the better you get at moving, the more variability we find. Someone who's not a very good mover, they might have only one path to take to get into a squat. But the reason why they're not a good mover is because when variables come into the mix, they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have the freedom to change up the movement as it's going. And that defines a good mover versus a bad mover. So what I do is I say, how do we get the most degrees of freedom in all of the articulations or joints involved in this movement? The more degrees of freedom you have, the more paths you can take, the more variables you can deal with, and the safer the movement will be.
And so, I think there's so much gold that was shared between those two sound bites right there. When you're talking about someone coming in to train in a system like DeFranco's, it takes a certain amount of enlightenment to accept the process, because it's not what you think it is when you came in. and it's much more involved from the trainer's standpoint than you as a consumer, or even as a good or a spectacular athlete can really attach to right away. Only through going through the experience do you start seeing the benefit. And sometimes they have things that they're going to be judged by and they need to accomplish, and those are like the power development and objective data to be able to show that there's an improvement, a measurable improvement in something that's qualitative that translates to their position or their role in their team and their sport. And so what's great is to hear Cameron talk about this concept, and it's kind of like a couple different concepts going on. He's doing what Dre was saying, which was saying, well, hey, if you don't have the prerequisite movement capacity, then I find something that will effectively get the result I want that doesn't challenge that movement, that requirement, while going back and building the attributes that are required in supplemental work. And then so you have not only when someone's fresh, their ability to achieve something, but this is a good concept of regressive skills training. We already talked about skills being more than just a particular skill. It's all of these things. He's training somebody to develop movement skill as well as anything else. And so when someone starts to fail, you can regress the skill and continue to get the training effect desired until that fails, and then you go back again. And then inevitably you get to a point where you're discovering as a trainer the exact same thing that Dre is saying. And sometimes that takes a longer process for a trainer to go from the top down. And then Dre comes in and he builds out this system that lets you go from the bottom up. And then what's great is if you're doing both of those things at the same time, that's really powerful. And that's what you heard Cameron saying in a nutshell, is that he's going from both directions from the get-go. And then
that defines a good trainer, right? If you can't do it, I get that question a lot at the seminar, is we get these high-level, you were there,
Yeah.
You get these high-level people, like these guys are high-level trainers, they're movers, and we give them some basic fundamental challenges with articular motion and dissociating joints, and they can't do it. So by the end of the first day, people leave thinking, well, this isn't good. I can't do anything. I don't have any of the prerequisites. But that's the point, is that if somebody comes to train with me, it's not like I say, well, you can't do anything. You just have to do these very basic exercises. You have to know how to lateralize, how to regress the movements to what they can do. But as they're doing what they can do, which is what you were saying, you have to give them work to get them up to par so that they can continue getting back to the original movement they couldn't do. And that's a thing. It's not like you just say, well, you're dysfunctional, you can't do anything, don't go home. You have to train these people, but you have to keep in mind, what are their deficiencies? How do I migrate around these deficiencies? And as I'm migrating around them, how do I build up their prerequisite movements so that they can get more complex with their training?
So I like to kind of categorize things as skills. You have skills on one side, and you have motor abilities on the other side. So the way I think of it is, if I use the word skill, I'm talking about a specific skill. So let's say like a back squat, that's a skill. Overhead squat, that's a skill. Achieving mobility in external rotation of your hip, that's a skill. So very specific we're talking about when we're talking about skills. When I talk about motor abilities, it's more general. So when I think of motor abilities, I'm thinking power, strength, mobility in general, things like that. So you have to look when you're training at, you have to attack a motor ability that you're trying to develop, but that doesn't mean you have to use certain skills, but you should always be aiming to develop more skills, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's what we were kind of talking about before, is like, I can do a single leg exercise and build strength as a motor ability using a certain exercise, which is my skill. And I might not be able to do a back squat properly yet, but that doesn't mean that I can't eventually do it. So I'm trying to broaden my skill set while at the same time I'm still training for strength. I'm just not using a back squat. You know what I mean? People think you have to squat, you have to deadlift to get strong. You don't have to do that stuff. You know, it's just, you just have to apply overload to your body somehow. So if you're doing it within functional ranges of motion that you already have, you're going to get stronger, you know, and then you just broaden your skill set over time to where you can maybe do a back squat someday, you know, an overhead squat, whatever it might be.
But you know what? We should mention, because I think people might confuse the message in thinking that if you can't do a particular movement, like let's say a Cossack squat. You guys know you've done Cossack squat before. You go on YouTube and you go, how do I do a Cossack squat? There'll inevitably be some guy who takes the movement and breaks it down into smaller chunks of the same movement. You know what I mean? Like maybe you Cossack squat onto a higher box and then get a little lower and then get a little lower. But that's not the degree of specialization that I'm referring to. The goal shouldn't be the ability to do the movement. The goal should be the ability to control the joints in a way that will allow you to do that movement easily. You know what I'm saying? You can't simply take a movement and make it a little bit simpler and then build yourself up. People do that a lot with pistol squats, I noticed. It's like, well, just pistol squat onto a high box and then just go lower and go lower and go lower. That will get you to a pistol squat, but it will also get you to premature degenerative arthritis in your ankle. Because just because you're doing these progressions, it doesn't mean you've fundamentally dealt with, should your ankle be in a pistol squat position? You might have circumnavigated your way to the movement. Should you be there? That's a different question altogether. And that's really the part that I think I'm bringing.
Well, not only that, right? And this is what you're saying and what Cam's saying too, is that
which is the same thing.
It's not necessary to do that movement.
That's right.
If it's not beneficial, then it's not necessary, nor is it should it be done at this point in time. But again, maybe we're going back even to that the CrossFit example of the overhead squats and 100 athletes that are very gifted athletes, that are they're top tier athletes in terms of their conditioning and their ability to perform work, but not necessarily clearing them for the prerequisites of that particular movement, right? And so, but we're not saying that the movement's wrong or bad. We're not saying that the athlete's bad. We're not saying that the sport is bad. Nope. We're saying that those athletes, to perform that thing, need to spend the time to build those prerequisites. And I think that's another part of the message I think that's important to touch back on, right? So no one's saying anything's bad. No one's saying anything's wrong. It's just all in the context of that individual on that day and what movement prerequisites they've developed or they lack, right?
I don't not like any movements. Any movement that a human being can do, I think it's trainable, and it probably should be trainable if you have the proper fundamental base on which to train it. Yeah. So I don't avoid anything. It's like neutral spine's a big one. You go to gyms and everyone's focusing on neutral spine, which fundamentally you have to. That's what you do at the beginning. But keep in mind that when you're in the cage for a next MMA fight and someone closes the distance and tosses you over their hip, when you slam into that floor, you're not keeping neutral spine. So the question that is going to differentiate you getting injured and not getting injured is how familiar is your body out of neutral spine? Well,
there are different configurations for different purposes, right? So if you do a judo roll and you're flat back, you don't roll, you plop, right? Same thing when you're getting thrown over someone's shoulder. Or if you're a boxer or an MMA athlete, you don't walk around with this proud in chest and this really flat configuration of your body because you're a big target, right? So you become kyphotic. You round the shoulders. You close the diaphragm off, and you create an angular relationship with the attacker or the opponent.
But in the gym, what are you told? Pull your shoulders back. Pull your shoulders back. Set your scapula. And I always say, and I do this at the seminar, I'll say, give me one athletic activity that is done with a set scapula, with your shoulder blades pulled back and down. Have you ever tried to throw a ball with your shoulder blades back and down? It's impossible.
Wait, do that again. That was awesome.
You want to see that again? But that's kind of, we're putting these people in these artificial positions based on some preconceived notion of what normal posture is, and we're training them in this normal posture. But I mean, Physiology 101, the law of specificity. If you're not familiar with a different position, your body's not going to be able to control itself in that position. So what I was saying was, yeah, you start with setting scapula, you start with neutral spine, but if you don't start to veer your way off and get into the dangerous positions as they're referred to, then when the dangerous position happens, you're done. Squatting's the best example. You ask 1,000 trainers, what's the best proper way to squat? Your feet have to be this way, and they have to be turned out, and they have to do this and that. If you were to monitor any human being throughout the course of a day and look at their foot positioning as they squat to pick things up, it's all over the place. I mean, we do movements that people in the gym would say that's dangerous to do, but you do that in your life. And the question is, are you prepared to do that, or are you not prepared to do that? And that's what we're saying. You have to be prepared for almost any type of movement that can come your way, any variable that comes your way.
Well, I think what's great about that statement is we had a good discussion yesterday. I must say, we sat outside and talked for a couple hours about a lot of the things that the common truths that we teach, and that Cameron touched on intuitively in this conversation as well, right? Without any prompting. So what's great about it is prerequisites. We already touched on prerequisites. So the ability to own a neutral spine is a prerequisite for a lot of people because they can't do it, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact is that you don't need to be in neutral all the time, but you need to know where it is, right? I mean, you need to be able to benchmark it and refer back to it. And then same thing with setting the scapula. It's not like you're going to, when we swing clubs, the scapula is in a very dynamic relationship. It's driving the motion of the club in a lot of ways, and it requires freedom. And that's another thing we were talking about. Is like, well, we start from this anti-rotational focus. Can you control this rotation? Because as soon as you can't control it, it's already telling us that there's a prerequisite lacking. Whether it's a prerequisite in terms of a movement, a mobility prerequisite, or in this case, a lack of being able to control that rotation is a lack of stability, right? So just to be able to have motion doesn't mean that you can control motion, right? And so you're looking at all these different things and you're saying, well, if you don't know why you're doing something, there's something wrong. If you can't control, like, I want to create movement or I want to create the absence of movement, there's something wrong. You should be able to selectively decide what's going on. And then through all of those experiences, and then training, various different ground engagement strategies. Obviously, you start to learn to contour your body to the ground and roll across your body surfaces, and become sensitive to different inputs. Mm-hmm. Like you said, like not wearing shoes and learning what it feels like to actually be in contact with the ground and have that relationship. And then you let your body do what it's supposed to do.
That's it. Right. Because you don't control the movements happen. But we brought up the word mobility a lot, and I think it's worthwhile to discuss what we're discussing and we're talking about with mobility, because it's very confused in the social media as to what mobility is. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, when they say I'm working my mobility, what they're doing is they're mobilizing themselves before a workout. But that's not the way I define mobility. In my definition of mobility, it's more about control. I care very little about how passively flexible you are. Mm-hmm. Like if you can do the splits at the end of yoga class, that's great. You might look good at the end of yoga class. But that's passive flexibility. When you're, for example, if you're grabbing a stretchy band and you're tying it to something and you're leaning forward, what are you doing? I'm working my mobility. Well, no, you're passively stretching with a band. Or if I'm foam rolling, or if I'm rolling on a lacrosse ball and somebody says I'm working on my mobility, like, no, you're mobilizing your tissues and joints in preparation for training. But to work mobility, as I define it, it's the ability to actively control ranges of motion. So it's the range or the flexibility plus the neurological control of the newly acquired range. So when we're talking about mobility, we're throwing the term out there because it's common, but I teach it as I use the word functional mobility just to differentiate those terms so it doesn't get confused.
And I think that's huge, and that's the way that I've defined true mobility training within our systems for a long time, because we've done all this open chain mobility work and it's about and you get a lot of really skilled athletes and even really talented movers or even really flexible, bendy, even lax type of athletes that come in. And within the specific patterns that they're challenged in, they have that active ability to engage musculature to stabilize the joint. And then everything outside of 15 degrees from there, there's absolutely no connection to their body in space. And then they cannot actively control their joints or the relationship. They don't even know where they're at in space. It's all of a sudden they might as well be in a zero gravity environment, and they just don't know. They don't know how to move into and out of those ranges. And it's amazing to see what type of deficiencies there are in good movers, in people that I admire their athleticism. I watch them on television, and I'm honored to be able to work with them in the context of them being in my facility and me spending an hour with them and me being completely blown away that the things that we need to work on are the same things that somebody who's not been active their whole life and lacks function of their joints, and we go back to the beginning. We're back at you don't have the prerequisites to be a normal functional human being without pain. You have the prerequisites to be an amazing athlete
and to compensate
really well
for your deficiencies.
Yeah.
I personally, and by the way, that you were talking about, you're in this position, you're stable, you're in this position, you're not. We know that's about 15 degrees based on the law of specificity. We know these things. If you're strong here, you're strong plus or minus approximately 15 to 20 degrees. Doesn't mean you're strong here. Doesn't mean you're strong here. And I think that fundamentally comes down to a misunderstanding of human anatomy as well. Because whenever you go to, watch someone talk, or if people have this conception that there's such thing as a muscle. So there's such thing as the bicep. But what I try to tell people is the bicep doesn't exist. The bicep is just a word that we invented in order to describe a collection of thousands and thousands of things. So when somebody thinks about movements and movement patterns, we're talking about, training 15 degrees. We're talking about training in a whole range and backing up each angle. Versus someone who thinks the bicep does this, they train this. But the bicep is made up of thousands of smaller units that could equally be called muscles in and of themselves. Every muscle cell functions as an individual muscle. So if you take the bicep, and let's say that your nervous system only activates this portion of your bicep, well, what's the resultant movement?
Angular rotational.
How about if I add this portion with the motor units over here, and those are the only two I activate? You see what I'm saying? So people think that your muscles do what the textbooks tell you they do, but it's way more complicated than that. The bicep originates somewhere in the body and inserts into the rest of it. It's continuous with everything else in the body, and it works at all of the available angles that a human has in very complicated ways. But we break it down because our primitive, our monkey DNA that's still left over needs to categorize things and say, this is a bicep, this is a hamstring. If you want your hamstring to work better, you need to bend your knee in this particular way. But it's not that easy. The anatomy of the body is far more intricate and far more continuous, that all of the degrees of motion that are available need to be trained. And that's why using tools like the bell, the clubs or the maces, where you have angular motions being challenged, this is all very necessary at a fundamental level to make our anatomy function the way it's evolved to function.
I thought that was one of the more eye-opening things for me, coming down here from New Jersey. DeFranco's, we were based up in New Jersey, partnered up with Onnit when we came down here, was I think my boss, Joe DeFranco, will kind of attest to the same thing, is we came from that very conventional background of training where, we're doing a lot of barbell lifts, things like that, with neutral spine, good technique, all that stuff, typically, what you would see in most conventional settings. And then coming down here, we start playing with a steel mace and a steel bell and steel clubs and, three-dimensional movement, so to speak, rather than uniplanar. We're talking about multiplanar movement and things like that. the more unconventional stuff, if you will, it kind of really opened our eyes to noticing like, wow, there's a whole piece of the puzzle that we've sort of been missing out on in terms of training, and how valuable it is for an athlete to be able to attain those type of skills. So it's interesting because we talk about now with, John and I, we'll talk about it all the time, is trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So we talk about achieving a huge spectrum of unloaded movement, and that's being able to own positions without any overload and things like that. And then you talk about your conventional exercises, which certainly have value, things like your barbell squat and things like that, being able to do those properly. And then we talk about the more unconventional stuff, putting yourself in awkward positions and trying to be able to own that position. So, we used to do some strongman training, which is very similar to that unconventional approach. Yeah. So you try to lift an Atlas stone with a neutral spine, you can't do it. You know what I mean? Something like that. So all that stuff has a huge carryover, because it's like you were saying before, Dre, and anyone else will say it as well. It's like when you're in the ring, or in the octagon fighting, or if you're on the football field or the soccer field, whatever it is, you're in so many different positions at once. And it really is that one moment that you're in an awkward position you've never been in, that something gives and something goes. So it's very interesting.
I would say you're going to regret the position. You're going to regret not training the position you got injured in.
Right.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people that are listening to this podcast, they train on their own at home, or maybe they go to a gym already, or they're looking for another gym. What are some resources they can find on their own online, maybe, to make sure that they're learning this type of stuff? Or what kind of questions can they ask a potential trainer that they're going to work with to make sure that they're implementing this type of training along with whatever their goal is?
It's a good question. I mean, for me, at a fundamental level, another thing that we talk about at the seminar is the first thing that we have to focus on is keeping joints healthy, right? That's the number one thing. And I think it's funny enough, it's the one thing that's ignored in almost every training system that I've encountered. It's what are you doing on a daily basis to make sure your joints are maintaining health? Now, if you look at the research and you look at what maintains joint health, I mean, you can take omega-3, like fish oils, and there's glucosamine, and there's all this stuff. But fundamentally, the only thing that keeps a joint healthy is movement. There's no other way for joints to the cartilage of joints to receive nutrients other than movement. There's no way for the nervous system to maintain all of the sensory functions of the joint unless you challenge them by movement. So one of the things that we talk about at FRC is a morning routine of something we call controlled articular rotations, or CARs. And every morning I have people perform their CARs. So what that means is they get up and they take every joint in their body, and one by one they do very large, they're doing very large circular motions in both directions with all of their joints individually. So you start with your neck, you move to your scapula, you move to your shoulder, you move to your elbow, move to your wrist, down the spine. Every joint gets touched. And while you're doing it, it's a self-assessment, because when you're making a circle, okay, let's say that I'm rotating my neck in one direction. If your joints are working well, the tissue that's limiting a range of motion is usually on the opening side. So if I'm starting this way and I'm rotating my left ear to my left shoulder, what stops me from going further? It should be a feeling of tension or tightness on the opening angle, the opposite side. If you feel pinching on the closing side, then that's a very easy way to notice that your joint is not working well. And somebody, be it a therapist or a very skilled trainer, needs to address that before you continue to do movements involving your neck. So for me, wake up in the morning, move all of your joints, scan your body, and make sure that you don't have any of these closing angle pinches. And just doing that, you'll be surprised. You do this every morning for a few months, and a lot of the times the pinches go away. The feeling when you get up in the morning and you feel like an 80-year-old, you're like, oh, I gotta bend. I always say, if you don't wake up in the morning and feel like you just warmed up for 20 minutes, there's something wrong with your joints. And I think for most people listening who are at home, they might not have access, just make moving your joints a habit, because the more you move them, the healthier they will be. The less you move them, the less healthier they are. And we know this. 100% we know that that is true. So for me, from my perspective, to get people to avoid having to come to see me to get on my table for me to treat them, I'd rather just train them. That's the one thing that I tell people to do. Just keep moving. And when there's something wrong with the movement, you feel pinching, get it addressed right away, because it's going to be a nasty injury later if you don't.
So you touched on this earlier, but joint health drives your quality of life. I mean, without a doubt.
Absolutely.
I mean, if your joints hurt, you are not a fully functioning, happy person. I mean, you're going to be in pain. You're going to lack physical confidence. You're going to have possibly carry over to different emotional states too, because you don't feel confident in your ability to defend yourself, because we evolved to fight,
sure,
as you said. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's only a handful of systems available for people to train in that address joint health as a priority. So I think maybe based on what Dre's saying is, if you value longevity, if you value pain-free living, and if you value the ability to do the things that you enjoy now and into later years in life, then find a system that promotes the integrity and the health of your joints and gives you the tools to do exactly what he said, to create a lifestyle around moving, to give you the tools to have a personal practice. When we in the academy, we say the same thing. This is your daily ritual. It's a conversation you have with your body. It's your assessment, and the assessment is often the cure. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need more guidance thereafter. But the first step is for you to take ownership and for you to go through the process on a daily basis, you to check in. It's like I tell people, it's like being married. If I go home and I want the rest of my evening to go well, my first concern is to ask how my wife is doing. Your body is your spouse for the rest of your life. Yeah. You wake up, the first thing you should do is ask your body how it's doing, and then be responsive to the information you get. Now, the only way to do that with your body is you can't ask. You have to move, right? The only way you know is by moving. And the only way you know truly is by moving every joint, as Dre said, through its entirety of its functional range. So doing that large circular motion takes it through its full functional range, and then assessing at this angle, there's tension. Is the tension opening angle or closing angle? And as he said, if it's closing angle, you need to probably see somebody who can help you with that if it doesn't fix itself through that assessment and cure process.
A lot of times, just doing it when your nervous system becomes familiar with the movement, a lot of these closing pinches, they go away on their own.
Yeah, in like a couple weeks. It's really short. It doesn't take very long at all.
Yeah, and it's you brought up a lot of good points here, but the combination of how you feel and how your body moves, I don't think people fundamentally give enough attention to the relationship, right? It's like the mind-body connection. I don't like the term mind-body connection because it somehow separates them, and I don't know where that separation occurs. Yeah. I mean, your mind and your body are the same thing. If your body's not working well, I mean, if you look at the research, when you're moving and you're exercising, your body releases happy drugs into your system. It makes you euphoric. It makes you happy. It changes your mood. Your body's telling you exactly what it needs by the chemicals it releases. So you go for a run and you start to get this runner's high. It's telling you, hey, I like what you're doing. Here's a little bit of it's like a Pavlovian response. I'm going to give you some happy drugs so that you keep doing what you're doing. And moving is a great way to release a lot of these happy drugs. And not moving means you're not getting these things released. Your cannabinoid system's not working. Your serotonin's low. All of these things factor into how you feel that day and your mood. And speaking of longevity, I always say that every client you work with, eventually their goal becomes, I just want to have healthy joints. Mm-hmm. You can say, I want to lift this much weight, I want to do this. When you're younger, I want to look good for an Instagram photo or whatever it is that you do. But eventually, you want to pick up your kid and you want to get up and down off of the floor. And if you were not thinking about this when you were 25, when you're 55, it's going to be that much harder
Yeah.
So, ton of great information, a lot of stuff. I think people should definitely follow you. Where should they follow you on social media? Where can they keep up with you?
Yeah, so I'm at Dr. Andreo Spina on Twitter and on Instagram. If you're out there and you're interested in either this, if you're a manual therapist, you're interested in the functional range release technique, or if you're a trainer or manual therapist, you're interested in functional range conditioning, functionalanatomyseminars.com is where you can go and find out seminar dates. We're doing them all over North America and Europe, and so you can check it out at functionalanatomyseminars.com.
Or you can come to DeFranco's gym at the
And
Onnit
you can
Academy.
ask John, who is a certified functional
October-
range conditioner. Oh, that's
October
right.
17th
That's right.
and 18th. So you can hang out with all three of us and, some stimulating conversation going
Yeah,
on.
we're doing. Yeah, so we have a cert going here. I'm happy to say, which now that we're speaking is almost sold out. So if you want to get on that, it's October 17, 18,
Yeah.
I believe. So that'll be a great one, and I'm honored to be able to do it here. Like I said before, I was a big fan of the products, and I like what you guys were doing even before I was fortunate enough to meet you. So it's really, for me, it's a really cool experience to be able to be here and do one of my certs here. It's exciting.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for listening in. Thanks, John. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Andrea. Till next time, catch you later. Peace.